Secret Lives, Chapter 2, written and read by Michael Mosier. Special Agent Lester arrives at 149 Constitution Place at 6:45 a.m. He reaches inside his coat pocket and takes out a small notepad and pen instead of his badge. He cuts through the small crowd of journalists and other onlookers, then ducks under the police tape blocking off the front lawn. A young, clean-shaven, uniformed officer advances towards him. "Sorry, sir, but you're going to have to get back. You see this tape? No one without a badge is allowed past it." Lester turns to look at the tape. He turns back to the officer to say, "Oh, well, you see, I saw that, but I am an officer." Expressionless, the officer says, "Is that right? May I see your badge?" "Of course, it's right here," Lester says as he grabs an empty space on the front left side of his belt. He looks at the space, then brushes the back of his head. "Ah, geez. I'm sorry. I always do that. I hope you'll forgive me, Officer, Lester pretends to search for his badge as he waits for the young policeman's name. "Dalton, sir." "Aha! Here it is. There you go, Officer Dalton." Lester says as he pulls out the badge, "I'm Special Agent Lester with the FDLA." Officer Dalton checks the badge and says, "Okay, you can go on in. Sorry if I was a bit rude." Lester clips the badge onto his belt and says, "No need to apologize. You're the doorman. I should have been wearing my badge. Now, could you tell me where Detective Underhill is?" "Yes, sir. He's in the kitchen interviewing the wife." "I believe it's at the end of the hallway on the left," Officer Dalton says. "Thank you, Dalton. You got a first name?" "Tim, sir." "Thank you again." With a smile and a nod, Lester opens his notepad while walking to the house. Dalton, Tim, rookie, honest, polite, observant. As Lester enters the front door, he avoids two members of the forensics team leaving from the staircase. Their white hazmat suits cover any distinguishing body part. Lester moves aside to the parallel hallway, heading for the kitchen. At the end of the hall, he turns left and slips into the kitchen. He sees Underhill sitting at the table on the opposite side of the room. But Lester takes a sharp right turn to avoid any eye contact. He walks between the kitchen island and the refrigerator, heading to the sink. He sees there are no rubber gloves for washing, and there are 3 glasses and matching dinner plates in the dish drainer, along with a smaller plastic cup and plate with divided sections. Lester can feel Underhill's eyes on him, so he opens the cabinet to his left above the sink and removes a glass. He returns to the refrigerator and fills the glass with water. As he turns around, their eyes meet. Underhill's widen like a dog waiting for its owner. Lester's eyes narrow, and he approaches Mrs. Jacobs from behind. He steps aside as he gets closer to Linda to avoid startling her. "And that's when I heard the glass break and then a flush," Linda says as Lester appears next to her. "Excuse me, Mrs. Jacobs. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought you might be thirsty," Lester says as he offers her the glass of water. "Oh, okay. Thank you," Linda says as her politeness overtakes her surprise of a man appearing from nowhere. Lester is about to hand her the glass when he sees a smudge under her nose. He pulls the glass back and says, "I'm sorry, ma'am. You seem to have something," pointing to the place on his face, then retrieves a handkerchief from his breast pocket. He hands her the handkerchief, and as Linda wipes her face, Lester glances at Underhill's notepad on the table. Average height, weight, male, black hoodie, pants, hat, rubber gloves, dust mask, headlamp. Woken by her mask removal, strange smell, could see, not move or talk, played each message, him, then her, turned her head to watch him die. Lester looks at Underhill with a disappointed expression. Underhill's eyes fill with fright, and he nods towards his phone, propped on the table and recording the interview. Lester's expression softens as he turns his attention back to Mrs. Jacobs. They exchange the handkerchief for the glass of water. While she drinks, Lester takes a quick sniff of the handkerchief. He gets a whiff of ethanol as he folds and returns it to his pocket. "Please excuse me, ma'am. So sorry to interrupt." As he backs away from the table toward the door, Lester looks at Underhill, then the notepad on the table, and back to Underhill with a hardened expression. He turns around, walks out of the kitchen, and into the hallway. "Officer Dalton," Lester says with a welcoming tone. The officer at the front door turns and smiles at Lester. "Find the detective all right, sir?" "Yes, sir, young man. But I got a question for you. Where's the crime scene?" "Oh, it's up the stairs and to the left. You can't miss it. Just look for the guys in the hazmat suits." "Well, thank you, young man. Oh, sir, I'm heading out, but if you got a second, can I ask you something?" "Okay, shoot." "Well, I'd love to work for the FDLE someday. If you have time, maybe later, could you maybe give me some pointers?" "Well, son, I got a feeling I'm going to be busy with this one," Lester says as he waves his hand around, indicating the whole house. "For a while. But here's my card." Lester retrieves a business card from his wallet and hands it to Officer Dalton. "If you got any questions, any at all, give me a call or send me an email." Dalton takes the card from Lester and puts it in his pocket. They shake hands, and with a friendly pat on the shoulder, Lester heads up the stairs. As he reaches the top, Lester forgets if the kid said right or left. He's about to turn and ask when a familiar voice calls from his left. "Yo, Columbo, over here." He turns to see what looks like a giant egg wearing large, half-rimmed glasses beckoning him at the end of the hallway. He recognizes Wayne Knight, the ME, in a white hazmat suit. As Lester approaches, he extends his hand. "Hey, DK. They told me you were working the scene. I've been looking for you." "I bet. What do you think you're doing?" DK looks at Lester's outstretched hands while raising both of his, still wearing latex gloves. "Oh, right." Lester retracts his hands and they bump elbows while standing outside the doorway to the master bedroom. "My team's just about done in here. I figured you'd get the call, so I was waiting for you," DK says as the last person in a hazmat suit squeezes between them to leave the bedroom. "You rode in with your team this time? I was wondering why I didn't see the Batmobile." "Yeah, early call. I was up late testing some new magic decks. We need to play again soon. Come over to the house sometime. Bring your wife. If she plays, I can get my roommate and we can play teams. DK says as he removes his gloves and unzips the hazmat suit. No, she hates the game. Says it's a waste of money. But you know what? Last night, I must have forgot to turn off the ringer. When the phone rang this morning, it about gave her a heart attack. DK chuckles and his large belly hops, shaking the Batman symbol on his shirt. So, what's the story here? Lester says as he waves a finger around the room. Well, it looks like the cause of death is most likely exsanguination from the femoral artery. The victim has about a 2-inch long cut on his left inner thigh, very close to the groin. The mattress is completely soaked through. From here, you could probably see the stains on the carpet under the bed. Lester bends his knees and squints towards the bed. Oh, wow. There was a fight? DK shakes his head. It doesn't seem so. When we arrived, the sheets were disheveled, but that's about the only thing that appears out of place. No marks on the doors or walls, no shattered glass, although we did find some glass fragments on the bathroom floor. DK points through the bedroom to the door opposite of him and Lester. We also found in the bathroom trash can a couple of cheap dust masks with rags inside. They were soaked in something. Kind of smelled like disinfectant. We bagged them and sent them off to the lab. Hang on, Lester says as he retrieves the handkerchief. Did they smell like this? DK takes a quick smell. It's faint, but I think so. Lester places the handkerchief in his pocket and says, well, that's the remnants of chloroform from the wife's mouth. I suspect the victim will have the same. DK cocks his head to the side and says, I'll check it out when we get to the morgue, but I'm guessing that'd be why everything is so tidy. He shrugs and gives Lester a stiff pat on the back. Well, good luck to you. Looks like you got a hell of a case. DK walks to the staircase. He turns quickly and says, oh yeah, one more thing. We also found an old handheld cassette player and 2 mini cassettes labeled his and hers. They were right there in front of the office door. DK points to the area just in front of Lester. We bagged and tagged the cell phone and computer as well. I should have a full report in a few days, but you can just drop by anytime. Thanks, man. And by the way, thanks for reminding me. DK looks at Lester confused. Lester smiles and says, I gotta get new tires. He looks DK up and down. DK looks down at his protruding belly in the white hazmat suit. He turns back to Lester, unamused, raises both middle fingers while walking downstairs and maintaining eye contact. After a few steps, he shakes his head and cracks a smile. Lester chuckles to himself and turns to check the crime scene. He looks around the floor, bed, and nightstands. He checks the walls from top to bottom. No askewed picture frames. The jewelry box and little knickknacks sit along the dresser and makeup table. Each piece has their undisturbed place. The walk-in closet is pristine and picture perfect. Nothing scattered or knocked out of place. He lies on the floor to look under the bed and sees the stains from the blood that dripped down through the mattress. He's just about to get up when he notices a slight, foot-long bump on the floor under the headboard. He pulls out his phone to document what he sees. He gets the pen from his notepad to inspect the bump. As he crawls under the bed, he sees the bump is a magnetic cover placed over the air vent. Lester sets his phone to record and props it against the wall to film everything he does. He uses the pen to pry it between the cover and vent. As the cover releases, a rush of air escapes the vent, and Lester sees the bedroom door open wider. Lester drops the cover, grabs his phone, and shuffles himself out from under the bed. He stands and turns to see all the windows are closed. He says, "The killer must have wanted to restrict the airflow. Why?" He thinks for a moment. Of course, it's a two-prong attack. The closed windows and air vents thicken the air for the chloroform, but also muffles the sound to the rest of the house. Lester walks to the bathroom and sees the window is also closed, and a magnetic cover on the air vent. He takes a few pictures, then closes the door. He inspects the rest of the room, but nothing seems to have been disturbed. He walks to the toilet and proceeds to relieve himself of his morning coffee. When finished, he pushes the handle, only for the toilet to stop once he releases. He flushes again, but this time he holds down the handle until completion. Lester walks down the stairs and hallway to the kitchen, all while checking for, and not seeing, any more covered air vents. He sees Detective Underhill is leaning against the kitchen sink with his arms folded across his chest, quietly watching Linda Jacobs. She's sitting on a stool on the opposite side of the kitchen island, but her attention is focused on the little girl sitting next to her. Underhill sees Lester and stands, releasing his arms to his sides. Before he can speak, Lester glides in front of him to face Linda. With understanding eyes and a hint of a smile, Lester holds her hand and says, "Mrs. Jacobs, please forgive me. I'm afraid we weren't properly introduced earlier. I'm Special Agent Lester with the FDLE. I'll be taking over for Detective Underhill. And, well, who's this little lady?" Lester says as he steps towards Caitlin and leans over the island. Brushing the girl's hair behind her ear, Linda answers, "Her name's Caitlin." She puts her arm over Caitlin's shoulder and kisses her head before hugging her. Lester stands up straight and turns to face Underhill. Without hesitation, Underhill whispers, "I've got the entire interview on my phone. I'll put it on a flash drive and send it to your office. The shrink said that little girl didn't see or hear anything, but should be with the mom to help process." Lester lowers his gaze and nods with approval. Then, he motions with his head towards the kitchen door. Underhill gets the message and leaves the kitchen. Lester turns back around to the little girl and says, "So, Caitlin." The girl looks up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. Lester's throat seizes. He looks down and clears it with a slight cough. His attention is diverted to the stove on his right. He turns and looks at them to say, "Have you eaten yet?" Seeing their exhausted faces, Lester taps his forehead with the palm of his hand. "What am I saying? I'm sorry. Please excuse the silly question. How about I cook you breakfast? Caitlin, dear, do you like eggs?" Caitlin looks to Lester, then to her mom, and shakes her head. "Okay, cereal for the little lady. Mom, how about you? Omelet?" Linda gives a slight nod and breathes, "Okay." Lester prepares the cereal for Caitlin and grabs a couple of eggs as he puts the milk back in the fridge. Placing the pan on the stove, Lester sees Linda is slouched in the stool, weak and weary. Lester cracks the first egg. Well, I should tell you, Mrs. Jacobs, I'm a terrible cook, but even my wife will admit I make a great omelet. Linda looks at Lester, but she's only mildly paying attention. Adding the eggs to the pan, Lester says, "Do you know the secret to making a great omelet?" Linda shrugs. "No eggs," Lester says with a smile. This gets a little chuckle from Linda. As Lester presents Linda with her omelet, he sits up and says, "Well, I guess you want me to go over what happened again, since you weren't here before." "Oh, no, ma'am. That won't be necessary," Lester says over his shoulder while washing the pan and mixing bowl. He places the dishes in the drainer, turns and glances at Caitlin before saying, "Detective Underhill already got all of that. If you don't mind, I only have one question pertaining to the ordeal upstairs." Linda looks at Caitlin and says, "Okay," before taking a bite. "Well, earlier you mentioned you heard a glass break and then a flush." "Mm-hmm," Linda says while chewing. "Do you recall hearing one complete flush, or was there a stop and start?" Linda swallows and says, It was one complete flush." She looks down at Caitlin and thinks for a moment. "I remember because at that point I had closed my eyes. I still wasn't able to move my head, and I didn't want to see what was in front of me anymore, if you know what I mean." Lester tilts his head back and says, "I understand." Caitlin drinks the milk from the bowl and sets it down. Lester reaches out and says, "Are you done with that, sweetie? The milk was always my favorite part. Is it yours?" She gives no reply except hugging her mom. Lester grabs the bowl and washes it. As he places the bowl and spoon in the dish drainer, he says, "Oh, that reminds me. Who did you have over for dinner last night?" Linda swallows hard. I'm sorry?" Lester lifts the pan and says, "Well, you see, there are 3 matching plates and glasses here, and 1 child's plate and cup. One for you and your husband, as well as Caitlin. But there's an extra one here, too." Linda says, "Oh, right. That was Tim. He's my husband's assistant baseball coach." Lester nods his head and says, "I see. And was this a regular dinner last night? Did he come over often?" Linda shakes her head. "No, last night was the first time, but we had planned to do it many times before. Something always came up. Steve wanted to show him some coaching videos up in his office. Apparently, Tim doesn't have a computer. Guess he's kind of a technophobe." "Ah, okay. Well, I'm going to have to talk to him. Do you know his last name or where he lives or works?" Linda hands Lester her empty plate and says, "I'm not sure where he lives, but his last name is Greer. I think he's working for some land surveying company." "Oh, okay. Thank you. Now, if you don't mind, I just have a couple of standard questions." Linda picks up Caitlin and holds her. Caitlin wraps her arms around Linda's neck and rests her cheek on her mother's chest. Linda says, "Okay. I'll make this brief. Did your husband have any enemies that you know of?" Linda shakes her head as much as her daughter would allow and says, "No. Steve was a great guy. always helping out around the office and neighborhood. He had a few squabbles with people, but I wouldn't say he had enemies. Fair enough, Lester says as he leans against the sink, folding his arms. Anyone come to mind that he seemed to have these squabbles with more than most? Well, he was always having arguments with our neighbor, Mr. Griffey, but I was able to mediate after I told him my dad is also a retired Marine. Lester nods. Did your husband ever get into a particularly heated argument with anyone? Linda's eyes widen. Oh, yeah. There's this teacher, Grady Hall. I'll never forget. He's the head of the teachers union. Steve pushed through some rule change or something while Grady just happened to be out of town. He took it personally, and I got in Steve's face. I thought I was going to have to call the police. He's been very cold and standoffish ever since. I hope he retires before Caitlin gets to high school. Thank you. Well, Lester begins before Linda interrupts to say, oh, and there's a guy out by Steve's office downtown. He's the head of some religious movement or cult or something. His name is something Phelps. Phillips? Lester says with a sigh as he closes his eyes and massages them. Yeah, that's it. He's always with his followers, protesting and hounding Steve about putting Christ back in school. I don't know why. Steve never ran on anything particularly religious. Lester says, Abraham Phillips. He's the leader of the Children of God. They have a compound just outside of the city along Highway 319. He probably thought if he could get Steve, the rest would follow. Well, thank you again. I just have one more question, but I'm pretty sure I already know the answer. Linda looks at him with intrigue. Mrs. Jacobs, to your knowledge, do you have any enemies or know of anyone that would want to cause you harm? Linda shakes her head and says, I'm a realtor. I'm friends with everyone. Lester smiles at Linda and says, That's exactly what I was thinking. He unfolds his arms and stands up straight, reaches for his wallet and pulls out a card. This is my card. He flips it over, writes the number 1 on the back and circles it. Call me any time. And if you ever need a break, he hands Linda the card. Just go to the community theater on a Saturday morning. Show them this card, and they'll take good care of you. Okay? Linda takes the card and nods her head. Okay. Lester looks into her eyes and says, one last thing. Do you have any other place you can stay? Yes, I have an open house a couple blocks away. We'll head that way soon. Lester says, do you have any family or friends that could stay with you? Yeah, my dad's on his way. Lester walks around to Linda's side and says, That's great. Always good to have a Marine on guard duty. He places his hand on Caitlin's back and says, It was lovely to meet you, Caitlin. She lifts her head, but only enough to look away from him. He looks at Linda to say, I know you hear it a lot, but seriously, call me anytime. I'll make sure to pick up or call back the moment I can. He lightly pats Caitlin's back and then turns and walks out of the kitchen.